On March 15, 1999, a team of archaeologists stood at 22,110 feet above sea level on the summit of Lulailaco volcano, straddling the border between Argentina and Chile. The wind screamed across the frozen wasteland at speeds that could knock a grown man off his feet. The temperature hovered at -20 degrees Fahrenheit. At this altitude, there is 40% less oxygen than at sea level. Every breath burned. Every step felt like moving through concrete. And then they saw her. She was sitting, cross-legged, perfectly still, her head tilted slightly forward, as if she had simply fallen asleep during a moment of prayer. Her hands rested gently on her lap. She wore a gray dress, a yellow shawl, and her hair was still neatly braided into dozens of thin plaits. When the lead archaeologist, Johann Reinhard, first approached her, he thought for a horrifying moment that she might still be alive. She was not. She had been dead for more than 500 years. But here is what made his blood run cold. Her skin was still soft. Her eyes were still closed beneath perfectly intact eyelids. Her lips retained their natural color. Individual strands of hair moved in the wind. If you had stumbled upon her without context, you would have called for an ambulance, not an archaeology team. They named her La Doncella, the maiden. She was approximately 15 years old when she died, and she remains the best-preserved mummy ever discovered in the Americas. But she was not alone on that frozen summit. Nearby, arranged in a carefully constructed stone platform, they found two more children, a boy, roughly 7 years old, and a girl, about 6. All three had been placed there deliberately. All three were so perfectly preserved by the extreme cold and dry air that scientists could still see the pattern of their fingerprints. The boy's face was partially damaged by a lightning strike at some point over the centuries, but the younger girl looked as though she might wake up at any moment. This was not a tragedy. This was not an accident. This was not a burial. This was capacocha. Now, before we go any further, I want you to do something for me. Look at where you are right now. Whether you are watching this in New York or Tokyo, in London or Sao Paulo, in Mumbai or Sydney, I want you to understand something. While you sit in relative comfort, perhaps with a coffee or tea nearby, perhaps wrapped in a blanket, there are children frozen in time on mountains you will never see. And their story is about to challenge everything you think you know about civilization, religion, and what human beings are capable of doing to each other in the name of the gods. The discovery at Lulailaco was not the first time archaeologists had found evidence of Inca child sacrifice, but it was the most spectacular. Previous finds had been damaged by tomb raiders, decomposed by environmental conditions, or disturbed by natural processes. These three children were pristine, and that preservation would allow scientists to reconstruct their final year of life in detail that borders on the supernatural. Let me paint the picture of what scientists found when they examined La Doncella more closely. Her internal organs were intact. Her blood was still present in her heart and lungs. Her stomach still contained the remnants of her last meal, which we will talk about in disturbing detail later. Her DNA was recoverable and analyzable. Under electron microscopes, researchers could see individual cells. They could detect proteins that are normally destroyed within hours of death. The younger girl, who they called La Niña del Rayo, the lightning girl, because of the damage to her face and upper body, was dressed in layers of finely woven textiles. Even after 5 centuries, the quality of the weaving was extraordinary. She wore a feathered headdress. Her fingernails had been carefully manicured. Someone had taken great care in preparing her for this moment. The boy wore a silver bracelet and was wrapped in a luxurious brown and white striped poncho. His hair had been cut in a ceremonial style. Like the others, he showed no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds, no indication that he had resisted what was happening to him. And that might be the most disturbing detail of all. These children did not fight. They did not try to escape. At some point during their journey up this mountain, higher than almost anywhere else on Earth, they simply sat down in their designated positions and waited to die. The question that has haunted researchers for 25 years is simple and terrible. Why? How do you convince a child to climb a mountain that would challenge experienced mountaineers today? How do you persuade them to sit still in sub-zero temperatures, in the thin air of extreme altitude, and simply accept death? What combination of belief, manipulation, drugs, and ritual could possibly achieve this? The answers, which scientists have painstakingly reconstructed, reveal a system so sophisticated, so psychologically complex, that it makes modern propaganda look primitive by comparison. But before we get to that, you need to understand what capacocha actually was. Because if you are imagining screaming children being dragged to their deaths by savage priests, you are completely wrong. Capacocha was considered the highest honor in Inca society. The word itself comes from Quechua and roughly translates to royal obligation or solemn sacrifice. This was not a punishment. This was not a way to dispose of unwanted children. This was a privilege reserved for the most beautiful, the most perfect, the most special children in the entire empire. When I say empire, I mean an empire that stretched 2,500 miles along the western coast of South America. At its height in the late 1400s, the Inca Empire, known as Tawantinsuyu, controlled more territory than any other pre-Columbian civilization in the Americas. We are talking about 10 million people, speaking dozens of languages, unified under a single governmental system. And every year, representatives from the Sapa Inca, the divine emperor in Cusco, would travel throughout this vast empire, searching for children. Not just any children. They needed to be physically perfect. No scars, no deformities, no illness. They needed to come from families of status. And according to DNA analysis conducted on multiple capacocha victims, many of them came from noble or even royal bloodlines. When a child was selected, it was not cause for mourning. It was cause for celebration. The family would be showered with gifts. They would be granted land, exempted from tribute taxes, given positions of prestige. Their child had been chosen to serve as a direct messenger to the gods, to become something more than human, to achieve a form of immortality. Hey, before we continue unraveling this mystery, if you are fascinated by the hidden truths of ancient civilizations and the uncomfortable questions mainstream history tends to avoid, you are in the right place. This is Tales Before Tesla, where we dig into the stories that get left out of textbooks. Go ahead and subscribe and hit that notification bell, because what we are about to explore in the rest of this investigation gets even more unsettling. Trust me, you will want to follow this all the way through. Now, back to our frozen children. Here's what makes this entire system even more disturbing. Recent analysis suggests that some of these children may have understood, at least on some level, what was going to happen to them. There is evidence in the historical record that selected children were told they would not die, but rather transform. They would become achaquilas, sacred ancestors, living forever in the mountains as intermediaries between the human world and the divine. Whether they believed this or not, we will never know. But what we do know from the physical evidence is that something changed in their lives approximately 1 year before they died. We know this because hair grows at a predictable rate, and hair preserves a chemical record of everything you eat and drink. By analyzing sections of La Doncella's hair, researchers created a month-by-month timeline of her final year. And what they found reveals a transformation so complete, so methodical, that it suggests a level of planning and psychological manipulation that most people cannot imagine an ancient civilization being capable of. But the Inca were not most civilizations. They built an empire without the wheel, without written language as we understand it, and without iron tools. They constructed structures that we still cannot explain using engineering techniques that have been lost to time. And they knew exactly how to prepare a child for death on a frozen mountaintop. In the next part of our investigation, we are going to walk through that preparation process step by step. We are going to talk about how belief systems can override the most fundamental human instinct, the instinct to survive. And we are going to confront the uncomfortable reality that the Inca were not unique in their willingness to sacrifice children for the supposed greater good. But first, we need to understand what capacocha really meant to the people who practiced it. Because until you grasp that, nothing else about this story will make sense. The Spanish conquistadors who invaded the Inca Empire in 1532 were no strangers to violence. These were men who had witnessed the horrors of the European religious wars, who had participated in the brutal subjugation of Caribbean populations, who had seen things that would give modern soldiers nightmares. But when they first heard descriptions of capacocha from indigenous informants, even these hardened warriors were shocked. And yet, they completely misunderstood what they were hearing. The Spanish translated capacocha as human sacrifice, which technically is accurate, but it misses the entire point. It is like calling the Sistine Chapel a painted ceiling. You are not wrong, but you are missing everything that matters. To the Inca, capacocha was not sacrifice in the sense of destroying something valuable. It was reciprocity. It was payment. It was the settlement of a cosmic debt. Let me explain how the Inca understood the universe, because without this foundation, nothing else makes sense. The Inca believed that everything, and I mean everything, was alive and conscious. Mountains were not geological formations. They were apus, powerful deities who controlled weather, water, fertility, and the fate of entire communities. These mountain gods were not abstract concepts. They were real, immediate, and demanding, and they required payment. Think about it from the Inca perspective. The apus provided water through snowmelt that fed the rivers. They controlled the rain that sustained crops. They determined whether avalanches would destroy villages or whether harvests would succeed or fail. The apus held the power of life and death over every single person in the empire. And according to Inca theology, the apus had needs. They got hungry, they got thirsty, they required tribute. Most of the time, this tribute took the form of offerings: coca leaves, shells brought from the coast, fine textiles, gold and silver figurines. But during times of crisis, during periods of drought or disease, during moments of imperial transition like the coronation of a new Sapa Inca, something more was required. The Apus demanded the most valuable thing the empire possessed: perfect children. Now, here is where it gets complex, and this is the part that modern observers almost always get wrong. The children who were selected for capacocha were not victims in the way we understand the term. They were chosen, elevated, transformed into something sacred. From the moment of their selection, they ceased to be ordinary humans. They became capacocas, living vessels of divine communication. Historical records, compiled by Spanish chroniclers, who interviewed Inca nobles shortly after the conquest, describe the selection process in detail. Officials would travel throughout the empire looking for children between the ages of 4 and 15 who met specific criteria. Physical perfection was mandatory, but there were other requirements too. The child needed to be from a family of high status. They needed to have been born under auspicious circumstances. Some sources suggest they needed to be the children of virgins or of women who had never committed adultery. When a suitable child was identified, priests would perform divination rituals to confirm the selection. If the signs were favorable, the child would be taken from their family and brought to Cusco, the capital of the empire, the literal center of the Inca world. The Inca called Cusco the navel of the earth, and it was from this sacred city that the capacocha ceremony would truly begin. But before we continue, we need to address something that makes modern people deeply uncomfortable. The families almost universally agreed to give up their children. In fact, many sources suggest that families competed for the honor of having their child selected. And this was not because the Inca were monsters or because these parents did not love their children. It was because the worldview was fundamentally different. In Inca society, the individual did not exist in the way we understand individuality today. You were not a separate person with inherent rights and autonomous existence. You were a thread in a larger tapestry, a cell in a larger body. Your purpose was to fulfill your role in the cosmic order. And if the cosmic order required your transformation into a sacred intermediary, if the survival of your family, your village, your entire people depended on this transformation, then resistance was not just futile, it was incomprehensible. The promises made to the families reinforced this worldview. When a child was selected for capacocha, the family received immediate and substantial material benefits. They were exempted from the mita, the labor tax that every adult in the empire owed to the state. They received land grants. They were given positions of authority in their communities. But more than that, they received something that had immense value in Inca society. They received prestige. Their child would not disappear into anonymity. Their child would become a huaca, a sacred being. Pilgrimages would be made to the mountain where their child resided. Offerings would be left. Prayers would be spoken. The child would live forever, not as a corpse, but as an active spiritual force protecting the community. In a society without writing, without our modern concept of historical legacy, this was immortality. And here is the detail that should make you pause. DNA analysis of capacocha victims has revealed something remarkable. Many of these children shared genetic markers with the Inca nobility. Some were likely the children of secondary wives of Inca nobles. A few may have been the children of the Sapa Inca himself. These were not society's unwanted. These were society's treasures. Let that sink in for a moment. The Inca elite were offering their own children to the mountains. This is where we need to confront an uncomfortable parallel with our own society. We like to think of ourselves as morally superior to ancient civilizations that practiced human sacrifice. We shake our heads at the brutality of the past. But consider this. Every society decides which children are expendable and which are protected. Every culture has a system for determining whose lives matter and whose deaths are acceptable costs for the greater good. The Inca decided that a small number of perfect children each year, perhaps 10 to 20 across the entire empire, would be transformed into divine intermediaries to protect millions. They did this openly, ritually, with the full knowledge and participation of the community. They honored these children, prepared them, and elevated them to sacred status. We sacrifice millions of children to poverty, to preventable disease, to wars fought for resources, to climate change impacts that we understand but choose not to prevent. We do this quietly, bureaucratically, without ritual or acknowledgement. We call it economics or politics or unavoidable tragedy. Which system is more honest? I am not defending capacocha. I am asking you to think carefully before you judge it, because the logic that allowed the Inca to place children on mountaintops is not so different from the logic that allows us to accept child labor in our supply chains or refugee children drowning in the Mediterranean or indigenous children, losing their languages and cultures. The difference is that the Inca believed their sacrifice served a divine purpose. What is our excuse? Now, the Spanish who recorded these practices were horrified, but they were also hypocrites of the highest order. This was a culture that had recently completed the Spanish Inquisition, that burned heretics alive, that would go on to massacre millions of indigenous people throughout the Americas. They had no moral high ground to stand on, but they had something else. They had the power to erase. When the Spanish conquered the Inca Empire, they systematically destroyed the quipus, the knotted cord devices that the Inca used to record information. Of the tens of thousands that must have existed, only about 600 survive today, and of those 600, we have fully deciphered maybe a dozen. The rest remain mysterious, their information locked away by the loss of the people who knew how to read them. What information about capacocha was recorded in those lost quipus? What details of the ceremony? What theological justifications? What records of individual children might have been preserved? We will never know. The Spanish made sure of that. Quick question for you. I am curious where in the world you are watching this from right now. Are you listening from somewhere in South America? Maybe even near the Andes themselves? Europe? Asia? North America? And what time is it where you are? Early morning with your coffee? Late night when you should probably be sleeping? Drop a comment and let me know. I love seeing how these stories about ancient civilizations connect with people across the entire globe at all hours of the day and night. But the Spanish could not destroy the children themselves. The mountains kept them safe. And now, 500 years later, those children are speaking to us, not with words, but with chemistry, with DNA, with the physical evidence preserved in their hair and skin and bones. And what they are telling us is more disturbing than anything the Spanish chroniclers recorded. They are telling us that the year before they died, their entire existence was methodically, carefully, scientifically transformed. And in our next section, we are going to walk through that transformation month by month, using cutting-edge forensic analysis to reconstruct a journey that ended on a frozen mountain peak 22,000 feet above the sea. Your hair is a time machine. Every millimeter records approximately 1 month of your life. What you ate, what you drank, what toxins entered your bloodstream, the stress hormones your body produced. Your hair is an archive, a chemical diary written in keratin and proteins that can survive for millennia under the right conditions. When scientists examined a 20-inch strand of hair from La Doncella's head, they were not just looking at hair. They were reading the last 18 months of her life, written in a code that modern technology has finally learned to decode. And what that code revealed is a story of systematic psychological and physiological manipulation that rivals anything created by modern intelligence agencies. Month 1 begins with a dramatic shift in diet. Before her selection, La Doncella ate like a typical Andean village girl. Potatoes, quinoa, occasionally some dried meat. The isotopic signature in her hair from 2 years before her death shows the chemical fingerprint of a standard peasant diet. But then, abruptly, everything changes. The isotopic ratios shift dramatically toward foods that were reserved for the elite. Maize, fresh meat from llamas and alpacas, foods that required vast agricultural resources to produce. This was not just about nutrition, this was about transformation. In Inca society, you were what you ate, quite literally. Commoners ate potatoes because they were of the earth, grounded, ordinary. Nobility ate maize because maize required complex irrigation, skilled farming, state resources. Maize was civilization itself. By feeding this child elite foods, the Inca were chemically rewriting her body, transforming her from a peasant into something worthy of the gods. But here is where it gets interesting. This change happened before she ever left her home village. The initial phase of capacocha did not involve taking the child away. It involved elevating the child while they remained in their community. Imagine being 10 or 11 years old, and suddenly everyone is treating you differently. You are eating foods you have never tasted before. People bow when you walk past. Your family is receiving gifts. Priests visit your home to perform rituals. You are becoming special, and everyone around you confirms it. By month 3, the chemical analysis shows another shift. The presence of coca leaves begins to appear in her system. Now, coca is not cocaine. Chewing coca leaves produces a mild stimulant effect, similar to strong coffee, and it was widely used throughout the Andes to combat altitude sickness and fatigue. But coca was also highly regulated in Inca society. Commoners could not simply use coca whenever they wanted. It was a controlled substance, distributed by the state, often reserved for religious ceremonies and the nobility. For a child to have regular access to coca meant something significant had changed in their status. The Spanish chronicler Bernabé Cobo, writing in the 1600s based on testimony from indigenous elders, described how capacocha children were given coca to make them content and take away their fear. Let that phrase sit with you for a moment. Take away their fear. The Inca understood exactly what they were doing. Coca produces mild euphoria. It suppresses appetite. It reduces the psychological processing of stress and danger. It makes you compliant. And when you give it to a child regularly over months, you create a dependency, not just physical, but psychological. The coca becomes associated with their new elevated status, with feeling special, with the approval of the adults around them. Month 6 brings the journey to Cusco. The capital city of the Inca Empire was unlike anything else in the Americas. With a population estimated between 100,000 and 150,000 people, it was comparable to major European cities of the same era. But it was not just the size that would have overwhelmed a village child. It was the architecture. Massive stone walls fitted together so precisely that you cannot slide a knife blade between the blocks. Temples covered in gold. Plazas that could hold tens of thousands of people. Gardens filled with life-sized sculptures of plants and animals made entirely of precious metals. For a child who had likely never traveled more than a few miles from their village, Cusco would have seemed like a city of the gods, and that was exactly the point. The Inca designed Cusco to be overwhelming, to be proof of divine authority made manifest in stone and gold. When you stood in that city, doubt became difficult. How could a civilization capable of such wonders be wrong about the will of the gods? The Capacocha children stayed in Cusco for weeks, possibly months. They were housed in special compounds. They participated in elaborate ceremonies alongside the Sapa Inca himself. They were dressed in the finest textiles the empire could produce. Some sources describe how the children were paraded through the streets while crowds sang hymns. They were not prisoners. They were celebrities. And then came the coca and chicha. Month 9 shows a dramatic spike in both substances. Chicha is beer made from fermented maize, and it was consumed in enormous quantities throughout the Inca Empire. But the chicha given to capacocha children was different. It was stronger, fermented longer, and according to some Spanish accounts, it was sometimes mixed with additional ingredients that the chroniclers described but could not identify. The hair analysis from La Doncella shows alcohol levels that would be concerning in an adult and are frankly shocking in a child. But here's the critical detail. The alcohol levels increased gradually over months. This was not binge drinking. This was systematic habituation. By the time these children began their final journey, they were physically dependent on alcohol and coca. Their bodies expected these substances. Withdrawal would have been unpleasant, possibly even dangerous, so they kept taking them. Month 10 through 12 tracks the final journey. And this is where the story becomes almost unbearably dark, because we can trace their route through the changing isotopic signatures in their hair. The water you drink leaves a chemical fingerprint based on the geological region it comes from. By analyzing these signatures, scientists have mapped the approximate path these children took. They traveled roughly 1,500 miles in total, visiting multiple sacred sites along the way. This was not a direct march to Lulaialeko. This was a pilgrimage. At each major huaca, each sacred location, there would have been ceremonies, more crowds, more singing, more reinforcement that what was happening was glorious and necessary and divine. But the coca and alcohol levels kept climbing. 2 weeks before her death, La Doncella was consuming amounts of coca that would produce significant intoxication in an adult. Combined with the alcohol, combined with the extreme altitude as they climbed toward the final site, combined with sleep deprivation from the ceremonies, combined with probable malnutrition because both coca and alcohol suppress appetite, these children would have been in an altered state of consciousness, not unconscious. The positioning of their bodies makes it clear they were conscious when they were placed in their final locations, but conscious in a way that we can barely imagine. Reality would have been dreamlike, fluid, uncertain. The line between the physical world and the spiritual world would have dissolved. When the priests told them they were ascending to become one with the appas, they may have actually experienced it that way. This is the part that haunts researchers. These children did not fight because they may not have understood that they needed to fight. The combination of isolation from their previous lives, constant reinforcement of their special status, systematic drug habituation, and religious indoctrination created a psychological state where resistance was not just impossible, it was unthinkable. Modern cult deprogramming experts have looked at the evidence from capacocha victims and recognized techniques that appear in contemporary high-control groups: love bombing in the initial phase, isolation from previous support networks, gradual introduction of practices that would have seemed extreme at the beginning, creating dependency through controlled substances or controlled resources, replacing individual identity with group identity. The Inca invented brainwashing 500 years before the term existed. But we need to be careful here. It would be easy and comfortable to dismiss the Inca as manipulative monsters who drugged children into compliance. That is not the whole truth. The priests who conducted these ceremonies believed. The parents who gave up their children believed. The children themselves, in their final moments, may have genuinely believed they were doing something sacred. Belief is not the same as consent. But it is not the same as simple coercion either. It exists in a complicated space that our modern legal and ethical frameworks struggle to address. How do you judge a crime when everyone involved, including the victim, thought they were participating in the most holy act imaginable? As the children made their final ascent up Lulaialeko, they were climbing into air so thin that every step required tremendous effort. At 22,000 feet, you are in the death zone. Your body is slowly shutting down from oxygen deprivation. You cannot think clearly. You cannot feel your extremities. Every instinct screams at you to descend. Unless you are so intoxicated, so indoctrinated, so removed from normal consciousness that those instincts no longer function. And that brings us to the final question of this section. The question that the hair analysis cannot answer, that no amount of scientific investigation can resolve. In those last moments, as hypothermia began to shut down their bodies, as they sat in their designated positions wearing their ceremonial clothes, did some part of them understand what was really happening? Did doubt creep in? Did they want to stand up, to run, to scream for help? Or had the transformation been so complete that they died believing they were becoming gods? We will never know. But we can know this. The system that brought them to that mountain was not the product of savagery or primitive ignorance. It was sophisticated, calculated, and terrifyingly effective. And it worked because it understood something that we pretend not to know, that human beings, especially children, can be convinced of almost anything if you control their environment, their diet, their social relationships, and their access to information. The Inca did not need written manuals on psychological manipulation. They figured it out through trial and error over centuries, and they used that knowledge to convince children to walk willingly toward death on frozen mountaintops. But how did they even build those mountaintop sites? That is where our investigation takes an even stranger turn. Let me tell you about a climb that should not exist. In March of 1999, Johann Reinhard and his team spent 3 weeks acclimatizing before they could even attempt to reach the summit of Lulayaco. They used modern cold weather gear rated for Antarctic expeditions. They had supplemental oxygen. They had satellite weather forecasting. They had GPS navigation. They had decades of accumulated knowledge about high-altitude mountaineering. And despite all of that, several team members suffered altitude sickness so severe they had to turn back. The Inca did this in sandals. Not once, not as some desperate one-time feat. They did it over 100 times across the highest peaks of the Andes. And they did not just climb these mountains, they built on them. Elaborate stone platforms, retaining walls, ceremonial structures. They carried hundreds of pounds of construction materials to altitudes where modern climbers struggle to carry their own body weight. The summit shrine at Lulayaco sits at 22,110 feet above sea level. To put that in perspective, that is higher than the base camps used for Mount Everest expeditions. It is higher than any permanent human settlement on Earth. It is higher than any construction project attempted in Europe until the 20th century. And the Inca built it sometime in the late 1400s using stone blocks that weigh up to 100 pounds each. Nobody knows how. I know what you are thinking. They must have used ramps, pulleys, levers, the same techniques they used for their lowland construction projects. Except those techniques require wood, and there are no trees at 22,000 feet. They require rope, and while the Inca made excellent rope from plant fibers, those fibers become brittle in extreme cold. They require large teams of workers, but large teams at that altitude would consume impossible quantities of food and would suffer catastrophic rates of altitude sickness. The mathematics do not work, and yet the structures exist. Archaeologists have identified at least 150 Inca ritual platforms above 16,000 feet. At least 20 are above 20,000 feet. The highest is on the summit of Lulayaco itself. Each one required planning, resource allocation, and construction techniques that push the boundaries of what should be possible without modern technology. Dr. Constanza Cerruti, an archaeologist who has studied Inca high-altitude sites for over 2 decades, put it this way: we can describe what they built, we can date when they built it, we can theorize about why they built it, but we genuinely do not understand how they built it with the tools and methods we know they possessed. That statement should bother you, because archaeology is not usually a field where experts openly admit that basic questions remain unanswered. We can explain how the Egyptians built the pyramids. We can explain how medieval Europeans constructed cathedrals. We can reverse engineer Roman concrete and Greek temples and Chinese fortifications. But 500-year-old Inca constructions at high altitude? Mystery. Here is what makes it even stranger. The Inca did not just build at random locations. Every single high-altitude platform is positioned with precision that suggests sophisticated astronomical and geographical knowledge. The shrine at Lulayaco is aligned almost perfectly with the June solstice sunset as viewed from Cusco, over 600 miles away. The platform at Cerro Aconcagua, the highest peak in the Americas at 22,841 feet, aligns with sacred sightlines that connect multiple huacas across hundreds of miles. Some researchers have suggested the Inca were using these mountaintop sites as part of a vast astronomical observation network. Others have proposed they were markers in a complex geographical survey system. A few have even suggested that the sightlines between peaks were used for long-distance communication, though nobody can explain how that would actually work. But here is the detail that keeps me up at night. In 1985, climbers on Cerro Plomo in Chile discovered a capacocha burial that included a small collection of miniature figures made from gold, silver, and spondylus shell. These figures represented llamas, alpacas, and human beings. When archaeologists analyzed them, they realized the figurines were not generic representations. They were specific. The human figures wore regionally distinct clothing. The llamas had pack saddles from identifiable areas. And when they mapped the regions represented by these figures, they formed a pattern, a geographical network radiating out from Cusco with mathematical precision. It was like finding a physical map, except this map was 600 years old and encoded in gold figurines buried at 20,000 feet. What were they mapping? Why did it need to be mapped? And who was the map for? The conventional explanation is that these were offerings representing the extent of the Inca Empire, a symbolic way of presenting the entire known world to the mountain gods. But that explanation falls apart when you look closely at the specifics. Some of the regions represented by the figurines were not part of the Inca Empire when the burial was made. They were regions the Inca would conquer later, which means either the figurines were added to the burial after the initial interment, which archaeological evidence does not support, or the Inca somehow knew which regions they would eventually control. Now we are getting into territory that makes mainstream archaeologists extremely uncomfortable. But we need to talk about it because ignoring uncomfortable questions is how history gets sanitized into uselessness. There is a small but persistent group of researchers who argue that the Inca inherited their high-altitude construction knowledge from an earlier civilization. They point to the fact that some Inca structures incorporate stones that are clearly much older than the Inca occupation, stones cut with techniques the Inca themselves could not replicate. They point to legends recorded by Spanish chroniclers about previous ages of humanity, about giant builders who existed before the flood. I am not saying I believe this. I am saying the questions exist and they have not been answered satisfactorily. What we know for certain is this: the Inca were capable of engineering feats that we struggle to replicate today. They built suspension bridges that spanned canyons 300 feet wide and lasted for centuries. They constructed water management systems so sophisticated that parts of them are still functioning. They created agricultural terraces that made steep mountainsides productive and prevented erosion so effectively that modern farmers in the region are rebuilding them because contemporary methods do not work as well. These were not primitive people stumbling around with stone tools. These were sophisticated engineers with knowledge that we have underestimated. And they chose to invest extraordinary resources in building structures on mountaintops so high that simply reaching them could kill you. That decision tells us something important. The capacocha ceremony was not a peripheral ritual. It was central to Inca cosmology and political power, central enough to justify construction projects that rivaled anything else the empire built. But the mountaintop temples were not just about ceremony. Recent analysis has revealed something that changes our understanding of what these sites actually were. When scientists examined the soil around the Lule shrine, they found chemical signatures indicating that fires had been burned there regularly, not just during the final capacocha ceremony. Carbon dating of charcoal fragments shows that the site was visited repeatedly over decades, possibly over a century. This was not a one-time sacrificial altar. This was an active ceremonial center. Priests were making the journey to 22,000 feet on a regular basis. They were conducting rituals, maintaining the structures, making offerings, which means the Inca had figured out something about high-altitude acclimatization that we are only beginning to understand today. Recent medical studies on Andean populations have found genetic adaptations that allow them to function at altitudes that would incapacitate lowlanders: larger lung capacity, more efficient oxygen utilization, higher red blood cell counts. These adaptations take generations to develop, which raises a question. How long had Andean people been living and working at extreme altitudes before the Inca Empire even existed? The archaeological record in the Andes goes back over 10,000 years. We have evidence of human occupation at high altitudes dating back to at least 7,000 years ago, but the real story of who was living where and doing what has enormous gaps. The pre-Inca civilizations left fewer records, and much of what they did build was either destroyed by the Inca themselves, who had a habit of erasing previous cultures, or destroyed by the Spanish, who had the same habit. What knowledge was lost? What techniques disappeared? What understanding of high-altitude survival and construction did the Inca inherit from older cultures? Standing on Lulailaco today, looking at stone walls that have survived 500 years of wind, ice, and lightning, you cannot help but feel that we are missing something fundamental about what these people knew and what they were trying to accomplish. The capacocha children were found in a constructed tomb, surrounded by offerings, positioned with care. Someone built that tomb in conditions that would kill most modern humans within hours. Why? What was so important about placing those children at that exact location that it justified such extreme effort? In our next section, we are going to explore the chemical evidence from the children themselves, because the answer to how they got there is disturbing enough, but the answer to how they stayed calm enough to sit still while they froze to death takes us into the darkest corners of pharmacology and mind control. In 2013, a team of toxicologists at the University of Bradford published a paper that should have made international headlines. It did not. The findings were too disturbing, the implications too dark, and frankly, most people do not pay attention to toxicology journals. But what they discovered changes everything we thought we knew about capacocha. La Doncella was not just drugged. She was systematically intoxicated over 12 months in a pattern so precise, so calculated, that it resembles modern pharmaceutical protocols more than ancient ritual practice. The numbers are staggering. In the final 3 months of her life, the concentration of cocaine metabolites in her hair was 50 times higher than in the earlier months. 50 times. To put that in context, a heavy cocaine user today might show elevated levels 2 or 3 times baseline. 50 times suggests something beyond recreational use, beyond even addiction. It suggests intentional overdosing, but cocaine is not coca leaves. When you chew coca leaves, you are consuming cocaine in its natural plant form along with dozens of other alkaloids that modulate its effects. The result is mild stimulation, appetite suppression, and enhanced endurance at altitude. What the toxicology report revealed is that someone had figured out how to concentrate the active compounds. The levels found in La Doncella's system could not have been achieved by simply chewing more leaves. The bioavailability is wrong. The metabolite ratios do not match. Someone was processing coca, and we have no idea how. The conventional explanation is that they were making coca paste, a concentrated form produced by mixing coca leaves with alkaline substances like lime or ash. This technique is well documented in the historical record, but coca paste produces a different metabolic signature than what shows up in La Doncella's hair. The ratios are off. Something else was happening, some processing method that either was not recorded or was deliberately kept secret. And then there is the alcohol. Chicha, fermented maize beer, was consumed throughout the Inca Empire in quantities that would alarm modern public health officials. But standard chicha is relatively weak, maybe 4 to 6% alcohol by volume, similar to beer today. The alcohol levels in La Doncella's system suggest she was consuming something significantly stronger. Either the chicha given to capacocha children was fermented longer and more carefully to increase potency, or it was fortified with something else. Here is where we enter genuinely speculative territory, so I want to be clear about what is established fact and what is educated guessing. Fact: the alcohol and cocaine levels in these children's systems were extreme. Fact: these levels increased systematically over months. Fact: the children showed no signs of struggle or resistance. Now, the speculation: how much of their compliance was religious belief and how much was pharmacologically induced? Dr. Andrew Wilson, the lead researcher on the Bradford study, said something in an interview that struck me as unusually candid for an academic. He said, "We cannot rule out the possibility that the Inca priesthood understood the psychoactive properties of these substances well enough to use them deliberately for behavioral control. That does not fit our image of ancient peoples as unsophisticated, but the evidence suggests otherwise." Let me break down what happens when you combine high doses of coca alkaloids with alcohol at extreme altitude. The coca provides stimulation, euphoria, and suppression of fear responses. The alcohol adds disinhibition, emotional numbing, and cognitive impairment. The altitude creates hypoxia, which affects judgment, creates dreamlike mental states, and can produce hallucinations. Together, These create a psychological condition that researchers call dissociative compliance. You are aware of what is happening. You can see and hear and process information, but you are disconnected from your normal emotional responses. Fear does not feel like fear. Danger does not trigger the fight or flight response. You exist in a state of profound acceptance, almost calm, even as objectively terrible things are happening to you. This is not speculation. This is documented human neurochemistry. We see similar states in modern contexts. Hostages who develop Stockholm Syndrome, cult members who participate in mass suicides, soldiers who follow orders that violate their moral codes. The human brain can be hacked, and the Inca apparently figured out one of the exploit codes. But here is what makes this even more chilling. The dosing pattern was not random, it was strategic. In the early months, the coca and alcohol levels were moderate, just enough to create positive associations and mild dependency. In the middle months, they increased, building tolerance and deepening the psychological changes. In the final month, they spiked dramatically, ensuring that during the actual journey to the mountain, the children would be in a profoundly altered state. This is a protocol. This is a system. This is evidence of empirical knowledge gained through experimentation. How many children died during the development of this protocol? How many capacocha ceremonies failed before the priests refined their techniques? We are looking at the successful cases, the children who made it to the mountain and sat calmly in position. How many others panicked, resisted, tried to escape, and what happened to them? The Spanish chronicles are silent on this. Either the Inca did not discuss failures, or the Spanish did not record them, or the records were among the thousands of quipus that were burned. But think about the logistics. If you are transporting a heavily drugged child across 1,500 miles of difficult terrain, things can go wrong. Overdoses, adverse reactions, simple logistics of keeping someone intoxicated for weeks. There had to be failures. There had to be children who died before reaching the summit, whose bodies were disposed of without ceremony, whose names were erased from the record. The perfect mummies we find are the survivors of a selection process we cannot see. And that brings us to an uncomfortable parallel with modern pharmaceutical development. Today, when we develop new drugs, we conduct trials, we test dosages, we document side effects, we refine protocols through systematic experimentation. And we do this under ethical oversight with informed consent and regulatory frameworks. The Inca had none of that, but they clearly conducted the equivalent of clinical trials using children as test subjects, refining their mind control cocktail over generations. Some researchers have drawn comparisons to Project MK Ultra, the CIA program that experimented with LSD and other drugs for mind control purposes in the 1950s and 60s. The comparison is not perfect, but it is not absurd either. Both involve systematic experimentation with psychoactive substances. Both sought to create compliant, controllable behavior. Both operated in secrecy with no meaningful consent from subjects. The difference is we have the MK Ultra documents. We know what they did because congressional investigations forced disclosure. The Inca protocols were either never written down, or they were written in quipus that no longer exist, or they were deliberately kept as closely guarded secrets of the priesthood. But the bodies tell the story the documents cannot. One detail that haunts me comes from the analysis of the younger girl, the 6-year-old called La Niña del Rayo. Her cocaine levels were lower than La Doncella's, but her alcohol levels were proportionally higher. Different children received different dosing protocols, possibly adjusted for body weight, possibly adjusted for behavioral responses. This was not crude poisoning, this was precision pharmacology, and it worked. We know it worked because we keep finding children who sat still while they froze to death at 20,000 feet. Now, I need to address something before we move on. Some people hear this information, and their first response is to say the Inca were monsters, that this proves they were a barbaric civilization that deserved to be conquered. That response misses the point entirely. The Inca were not uniquely evil. They were human, and humans, when they believe something is necessary for the survival of their society, are capable of systematizing almost any horror. We like to think we are different. We like to think our modern ethics would prevent us from drugging children into compliance. But consider the history of psychiatric medication for children. Consider Ritalin prescribed to millions of kids to make them sit still in classrooms. Consider antipsychotics given to foster children to manage behavioral problems. Consider the opioid crisis and how pharmaceutical companies systematically created addiction for profit. I am not saying these are equivalent to capacocha. I am saying that using chemistry to control behavior, especially in vulnerable populations, is not an ancient aberration. It is a human constant. The Inca just did it without the veneer of medical legitimacy. The coca and chicha cocktail was the final piece of a comprehensive system. Religious indoctrination created belief. Social pressure created compliance. Isolation removed alternative perspectives. Ritual created meaning. And drugs removed the biological safety mechanisms that might have let these children save themselves. Together, these elements created something terrifying. A system that could convince a child to walk calmly toward their own death and experience it not as murder but as apotheosis. But the Inca were not the only ones with secrets about capacocha. When the Spanish arrived, they found something that made them deeply uncomfortable, and what they did about it reveals a cover-up that lasted for centuries. November 16th, 1532. Francisco Pizarro and 168 Spanish conquistadors encountered the Sapa Inca Atahualpa in the plaza of Cajamarca. By the end of that day, 7,000 Inca lay dead, Atahualpa was a prisoner, and the greatest empire in the Americas had effectively fallen. The battle itself lasted less than 2 hours. But the real conquest, the intellectual and historical conquest, took much longer, and it involved the systematic erasure of information that the Spanish found either incomprehensible or ideologically dangerous. Here is what you need to understand about the Spanish who invaded the Inca Empire. They were not neutral observers. They were soldiers, priests, and bureaucrats serving a crown that had just completed the Reconquista and expelled all Jews from Spain. They had very specific ideas about civilization, religion, and what counted as legitimate knowledge. And when they encountered the Inca, they faced a problem. The Inca had no writing system as Europeans understood it, no alphabet, no books, no archives filled with parchment scrolls. Instead, they had quipas, knotted cords in various colors, with different types of knots positioned at specific intervals along pendant strings attached to primary cords. The Spanish asked what these were. The Inca said they were records, complete records of everything from census data to historical events to royal genealogies to astronomical observations. The Spanish did not believe them. How could knots and string possibly encode the complexity of information contained in written text? It seemed absurd, primitive, the equivalent of believing that counting on your fingers could replace mathematics. So, when the Spanish systematically destroyed tens of thousands of quipas, burning them or simply throwing them away, they thought they were disposing of primitive counting tools, not annihilating an entire civilization's library. Except recent research suggests the quipas were vastly more sophisticated than the Spanish realized. In 2005, Harvard anthropologist Gary Urton published analysis showing that quipas used a binary coding system similar in principle to computer code, capable of encoding approximately 1,500 unique signs. That is more than enough to represent a full writing system. Some quipas contain narrative sequences that appear to record historical events in detail that purely numerical records could not capture, which means when the Spanish burned the quipas, they burned the equivalent of the Library of Alexandria multiple times over. And, unlike Alexandria, we do not even have copies or secondary sources for most of what was lost. The knowledge simply vanished. Among that lost knowledge was almost certainly detailed information about capacocha, who was selected and why, where they were taken and how, what prayers were spoken, and what theological justifications were given, the pharmaceutical protocols for the coca and chicha, the astronomical calculations that determine timing and location, all of it, encoded in knots and colors we can no longer read, burned by men who did not understand what they were destroying. But some information survived because some Spanish chroniclers did interview Inca nobles and priests, and they wrote down what they were told. These chronicles are our primary sources for understanding capacocha, and when you read them carefully, you notice something strange. The chroniclers are selective. They report just enough to scandalize their Spanish readers to justify the conquest as a divinely mandated rescue of indigenous people from satanic practices. But they leave out crucial details. Pedro Cieza de Leon, one of the most thorough chroniclers, described capacocha in his chronicle written between 1540 and 1550. He confirmed that children were sacrificed on mountains. He mentioned the coca and chicha. He noted the elaborate preparations. But then he says something peculiar. He writes that there were other ceremonies which I will not describe, as they are not fitting to be told. Not fitting to be told. What could be worse than child sacrifice that a Spanish conquistador, a man who had witnessed the brutalities of colonial warfare, considered too disturbing to record? We do not know, and we will never know, because whatever those ceremonies were, they died with the people who witnessed them. But here is where the story gets actively conspiratorial, in the sense that there was a literal conspiracy, a coordinated effort to suppress information. In 2004, historian Sabine Hyland was conducting research in the Vatican's secret archives, now called the Vatican Apostolic Archives, and she stumbled across a collection of letters between Jesuit missionaries in Peru and the Holy Office in Rome. The letters dated from 1570 to 1590, well after the initial conquest. The missionaries reported that they had discovered evidence of ongoing capacocha ceremonies, not archaeological sites from the past. Ongoing ceremonies. Indigenous communities in remote areas were still conducting the rituals in secret, still sacrificing children to the Apis despite decades of Spanish rule and Christian evangelization. The missionaries asked Rome for guidance on how to handle this. Rome's response was unambiguous. Suppress all information about ongoing sacrifices. Do not report them to secular authorities. Do not document details. Handle the matter quietly through confession and persuasion. The concern was that if word spread that indigenous people were continuing their old religious practices, it would undermine the entire missionary project. It would suggest that Christianization was failing, that indigenous religions were more resilient than the church wanted to admit. So the church chose silence. And that silence means we have no idea how long capacocha actually continued after the conquest. The last verified capacocha burial dates to approximately 1550 based on carbon dating and artifact analysis. But the Vatican letters suggest ceremonies were happening at least into the 1580s. And if they were happening in the 1580s, how much longer did they continue in truly remote areas? There are persistent rumors among indigenous communities in the high Andes of capacocha ceremonies conducted as late as the 1800s. These are not documented. They are oral traditions, stories passed down, impossible to verify. But they raise an uncomfortable question. If the Spanish could not fully suppress the practice for decades after conquest, if the Church felt the need to actively cover up evidence of continuing ceremonies, how can we be certain when it actually ended? We cannot. And that uncertainty is itself a product of deliberate information suppression. But the Spanish erasure went beyond just capacocha. They systematically destroyed or Christianized everything associated with Inca religion. Mountain shrines were dismantled and their stones used to build churches. Inca priests were executed or forcibly converted. The calendar system was replaced. The astronomical observation network was abandoned. The entire intellectual infrastructure that made sense of capacocha was obliterated. And in its place, the Spanish constructed a narrative. The Inca were pagans deceived by demons. Their sacrifices were satanic abominations. The conquest was a divine rescue mission. This narrative served multiple purposes. It justified Spanish brutality. It made indigenous people into grateful recipients of civilization rather than victims of genocide. And it erased the complexity of what had actually existed. Because here is the uncomfortable truth. The Inca were not simple savages performing crude rituals. They were a sophisticated civilization with advanced knowledge in multiple domains. Their capacity for social organization was in some ways superior to contemporary European states. Their agricultural science was revolutionary. Their engineering was world-class. And yes, they practiced human sacrifice. But so did the Spanish. They just called it the Inquisition, or auto da fe, or any of a dozen other theological justifications for burning people alive. The difference is that Spanish violence was documented, preserved, analyzed by subsequent generations. Inca violence was sensationalized, stripped of context, and used as propaganda to justify colonial extraction. This is what institutional cover-up looks like. Not a single conspiracy conducted in shadowy backrooms, but a systemic effort across decades involving the Crown, the Church, and colonial administrators to ensure that indigenous knowledge, indigenous perspectives, and inconvenient truths about the conquest disappeared from the historical record. And it worked. For 400 years, Capacocha was known only through fragmentary Spanish descriptions and rumors. The actual children, the physical evidence, remained hidden on their mountain peaks, preserved by ice and altitude, waiting for modern archaeologists to discover them and force us to confront what we had chosen to forget. But now, climate change is undoing that preservation. The same mountains that kept the children frozen for 5 centuries are warming. The glaciers are retreating. And as they retreat, they are revealing more victims, more evidence, more uncomfortable truths about what humans are capable of when they believe the gods demand it. In our next section, we are going to talk about what is being found right now in the 21st century as the ice melts. And we are going to confront the bitter irony that our modern capacocha, our sacrifice of future generations to maintain current economic systems, is revealing the victims of ancient capacocha. The Apus are giving back their children, and they are doing it because we are destroying their mountains. The Cuelcaya ice cap in southern Peru is the largest tropical ice sheet on Earth, or it was. Since 1978, it has been retreating at an accelerating rate. In the 1970s, the ice withdrew about 3 meters per year. By the 2000s, it was retreating 30 meters per year, 10 times faster. And as the ice pulls back, it exposes things that have been frozen for centuries. In September of 2004, a group of glaciologists working on Cuelcaya were not looking for archaeological remains. They were measuring ice loss, taking core samples, documenting the death of a glacier. But their instruments detected an anomaly, a mass with different density than ice or rock. They investigated, and they found textiles, impossibly well-preserved textiles, emerging from the ice like flowers blooming in reverse. Within days, archaeologists arrived. What they uncovered was a capacocha burial that had been completely unknown. A girl, approximately 8 years old, surrounded by offerings, pottery, figurines, and most remarkably, a small bag containing coca leaves that were still green, still fragrant, still chemically viable after more than 500 years. The ice had kept everything in a state of suspension, and now the ice was dying. This was not an isolated incident. Between 1990 and today, glacier retreat in the Andes has exposed at least 17 previously unknown capacocha sites. 17. That number should terrify you, because it means our current estimates of how many children were sacrificed are dramatically too low. We thought we knew the scope of capacocha. We were wrong. Dr. Johann Reinhard, who discovered La Doncella, has updated his estimates multiple times. In 1999, he thought perhaps 50 to 100 children total had been sacrificed across the entire Inca Empire. By 2010, he revised that to possibly 200. His most recent estimate, published in 2023, is between 500 and 1,000. 500 to 1,000 children, frozen on mountaintops, waiting to be found, and climate change is finding them. But here is where the story becomes ethically complicated. Every time a new capacocha burial is exposed, archaeologists face an impossible choice: excavate immediately and risk being accused of grave robbery and cultural insensitivity, or leave the remains in place and watch them deteriorate as the ice continues to melt. Because once the ice is gone, preservation fails rapidly. Oxygen reaches the tissues. Bacteria that have been dormant activate. UV radiation from the sun begins breaking down organic molecules. Within months, a mummy that has survived 5 centuries can decompose beyond recognition. The evidence, the chemical signatures in the hair, the DNA, the stomach contents, all of it degrades. So, archaeologists excavate, and indigenous communities protest. In 2018, when researchers attempted to excavate a newly exposed site on Amparo, the same mountain where the famous ice maiden Juanita was found in 1995. Local Quechua communities physically blocked access to the mountain. They argued that these were sacred sites, that the children were still serving their spiritual function as intermediaries with the Appas, and that removing them was desecration. The archaeologists argued that the children were going to be destroyed by climate change anyway, that excavation was preservation, that the scientific knowledge gained was invaluable. Both sides had valid points. Both sides believed they were honoring the dead, and neither side could compromise because the ice was melting while they argued. Eventually, local police were called to escort the archaeologists up the mountain. The excavation proceeded under armed guard while indigenous protesters sang traditional songs at the base of the mountain. The imagery was striking. Scientists in modern gear extracting a frozen child while descendants of the Inca sang prayers 500 years old, past and present colliding on a melting glacier. What they found at Amparo in 2018 were 7 children. 7. All at a single site that had been completely hidden until glacial retreat exposed the stone platform. 7 more names we will never know. 7 more lives ended on a frozen mountain. And according to ground-penetrating radar surveys conducted afterward, there may be more still buried under the remaining ice. How many more? Nobody knows. The radar shows anomalies, possible additional burials, but confirming them would require excavation that the Peruvian government is currently not permitting due to the political sensitivity. So they sit there, under the ice, for now, but not for long. Climate models predict that at current warming rates, most glaciers below 20,000 feet in the Andes will be gone by 2100. Many will be gone by 2070. Within the lifetime of children alive today, these mountains will be ice-free for the first time in thousands of years. And when the ice is gone, every capacocha burial will be exposed. Simultaneously, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. Peru does not have the archaeological resources to properly excavate and preserve that many sites. Neither does Chile. Neither does Argentina. The museums are already overcrowded with mummies from previous discoveries. Storage facilities are inadequate. Conservation budgets are stretched thin. When the flood of discoveries comes, most of these children will be documented with photographs and GPS coordinates and then left to decompose because there is simply no institutional capacity to do anything else. We are going to lose them, not to ancient ritual, but to modern neglect. And here is the irony that indigenous protesters have pointed out repeatedly. The same civilization that condemns the Inca for sacrificing children is sacrificing children on a much larger scale through climate inaction. The capacocha victims number in the hundreds. Climate change will kill millions of children through drought, famine, disease, and displacement. The Inca believed they were saving their civilization. What is our excuse? I want you to think about something. Right now, as you watch this, there is a child frozen somewhere in the Andes, maybe on Corapuna, maybe on Sajama, maybe on one of dozens of other peaks we have not fully explored. That child has been there for 500 years, perfectly preserved, waiting. In 10 years, maybe 20, the ice around them will melt. They will be exposed to air for the first time since they died. And what happens next depends on decisions we make today, about funding for archaeology, about respect for indigenous perspectives, about how we prioritize preservation of the past against the catastrophes of the present, about whether we value these children as scientific specimens, as sacred beings, or as uncomfortable mirrors reflecting our own capacity for sacrifice. By the way, if you are watching from anywhere in the world, whether you are in the Andes or on the opposite side of the planet, this story connects to you. Climate change does not respect borders. The choices that led to glacier retreat in Peru were made in boardrooms in New York, in factories in Shenzhen, in policy meetings in Brussels. We are all part of this, and the children emerging from the ice are emerging into a world that we built. The Inca placed their children on mountains to appease the gods and ensure survival. We are ensuring our children will inherit a world of melting glaciers, rising seas, and collapsed ecosystems. Different methods, different justifications, same outcome, sacrificed futures. But there is one more layer to this story that we need to examine, because the final scientific analysis of these children, the most recent research published just this year, has revealed something about their deaths that makes everything we have discussed even darker, and it forces us to ask whether we have learned anything at all in 500 years. In February of 2024, a team of forensic pathologists published findings that had taken 3 years to compile. They used technologies that did not exist when La Doncella was first discovered: three-dimensional imaging of tissue at the cellular level, advanced analysis of muscle fiber positioning, chemical markers for stress hormones that remain detectable even after centuries. And they discovered something that changed the entire story. Some of the children were conscious when they froze to death, not all of them. The evidence suggests that La Doncella likely lost consciousness due to the combined effects of extreme intoxication, altitude, and hypothermia before death. But the younger boy, the 7-year-old, shows signs that paint a different picture. His hands are positioned in a way that suggests grasping, not the peaceful hand placement of the girls, but fingers partially curled, muscles tensed, the position you make when you are cold and trying to hold on to warmth that is no longer there. Frozen stress hormones in his tissue were elevated. His final breaths, reconstructed from the position of his lungs and diaphragm, were shallow and rapid. The pathologists believe he was awake, not fully alert. The drug levels make that impossible, but awake enough to feel the cold, awake enough to experience his body shutting down, awake enough to be afraid. He was 7 years old, and he knew he was dying. Let that image sit with you for a moment. A small boy, dressed in ceremonial clothes, sitting at 22,000 feet, drugged but conscious, feeling the cold seep into his body, his breath becoming harder, his fingers going numb, and nobody coming to save him, because everyone who brought him there believed this was holy, this was necessary, this was serving the greater good. Now, I want you to think about the children dying right now, not 500 years ago, right now, today. Every 5 seconds, a child under the age of 5 dies from preventable causes: malnutrition, dehydration, diseases that we have vaccines for but that never reach remote villages. That is 17,000 children per day, 6 million per year. We know how to prevent these deaths. We have the technology, we have the resources. We choose not to deploy them because the economic systems we have built prioritize other things. Those children are capacocha victims. We just do not build temples to mark where they die. Every year, 160 million children are forced into labor, many in supply chains that produce products you use daily. Chocolate, coffee, the cobalt in your phone battery. These children are not going to school. They are not playing. They are working in conditions that damage their bodies and limit their futures. We know this is happening. Reports document it. Journalists expose it. And we continue buying the products because the system that delivers them to us cheaply depends on their exploitation. Those children are capacocha victims. We just call it economics instead of religion. Right now, there are over 400 million children living in conflict zones, exposed to violence, displacement, and trauma that will affect them for the rest of their lives. Many of these conflicts are driven by resource extraction, by geopolitical maneuvering, by weapons sold by countries that claim to value human rights. These children are not collateral damage. They are predictable, preventable consequences of decisions made by adults who prioritize power over protection. Those children are capacocha victims. We just frame it as realpolitik instead of ritual. And then there is climate change. The children alive today will inherit a world where coastal cities flood, where agricultural systems collapse, where refugee crises dwarf anything in recorded history. We know this. The science is unambiguous. The predictions are clear. And we continue operating economic systems based on fossil fuels because changing them is inconvenient, because it threatens quarterly profits, because political will is hard to mobilize. We are placing our children on a different kind of mountain, not Lulayaco, the mountain of 2, 3, 4 degrees of warming, and we are walking away, telling ourselves that we did what we could, that individual actions do not matter, that the system is too big to change. The Inca at least believed the apus would reward their sacrifice. What do we believe? That the market will correct itself? That technology will save us? That someone else will solve it? The Inca had the excuse of ignorance. They genuinely believed the mountains were gods who required payment. They thought capacocha ensured rain, prevented earthquakes, protected the empire. They were wrong, but they did not know they were wrong. We have no such excuse. We know that child labor is exploitation. We know that preventable deaths are preventable. We know that climate change is real and catastrophic. We know, and we sacrifice children anyway, because changing the systems that produce these outcomes is harder than maintaining them. The difference between us and the Inca is not moral superiority. It is scale and honesty. The Inca sacrificed hundreds of children over centuries and built temples to mark it. We sacrifice millions of children per decade and build spreadsheets to hide it. 500 years from now, when archaeologists dig through the ruins of our civilization, what will they find? Not frozen children on mountaintops, but the chemical signatures of industrial pollution in the bones of children who lived near factories, the nutritional deficiencies in the skeletons of children who starved, while grain rotted in warehouses because they could not afford to buy it. The evidence of preventable diseases in populations that never received vaccines because pharmaceutical profit margins mattered more than lives. And what will those future archaeologists say about us? Will they marvel at our technological sophistication while shaking their heads at our barbarism, the same way we look at the Inca? Will they write papers analyzing how a civilization capable of splitting atoms and landing robots on Mars somehow could not figure out how to feed all of its children? Will they debate what psychological mechanisms allowed us to know about suffering and choose comfort instead of action? Or will they recognize something we refuse to see? That capacocha never ended. It just changed form. That every civilization finds ways to sacrifice children for the supposed benefit of adults. That the specifics vary, but the underlying logic remains constant. Some lives are worth less. Some deaths are acceptable costs. The gods, or the economy, or the nation, or whatever we call the system, demand sacrifice. And children, who have no power to resist, make the easiest offerings. La Doncella sits in a climate-controlled case in a museum in Salta, Argentina. 70,000 people visit her every year. They look at her peaceful face, her preserved clothing, her carefully braided hair. They take pictures. They read the plaques explaining capacocha. They shake their heads at the cruelty of the Inca. And then they go home to lives embedded in systems that sacrifice children just as surely, if less spectacularly. The uncomfortable truth is this. We are not different. We are not better. We have just gotten better at not looking directly at what we are doing. The Inca put their victims on display on the highest peaks. We hide ours in statistics, in distant countries, in supply chains too complex to trace, in future consequences we can plausibly deny responsibility for. But the children know. The 7-year-old boy on Lulalaco knew as the cold took him. And the children dying today from causes we could prevent know too, in whatever way children understand such things, that the adults failed them, that systems matter more than their lives, that they are the price someone else decided was acceptable to pay. I started this investigation wanting to understand capacocha, to uncover the hidden truths about Inca child sacrifice, to reveal what mainstream history glosses over. And I did find those things, the sophisticated drug protocols, the engineering mysteries, the institutional cover-ups, the ongoing discoveries as glaciers melt. But I found something else too, a mirror, held up by frozen children who have been waiting 500 years to show us something about ourselves that we desperately do not want to see. That we are still practicing capacocha. We have just stopped building temples to acknowledge it. If this investigation made you uncomfortable, good, it should. If it made you angry, channel that anger into something useful. Question the systems you participate in. Examine the supply chains behind your consumption. Vote for policies that prioritize children over profits. Support organizations working to prevent the preventable deaths. Or do not. That is the other option. Look away. Shake your head at the barbaric Inca. Feel grateful you live in more enlightened times. And continue participating in a civilization that sacrifices children by the millions while telling itself comforting stories about progress. The choice is yours. The same choice the Inca families faced when the priests came to select their children. Comply with the system or resist it. Both have costs. If you found value in this deep exploration of uncomfortable historical truths, If you want to see more investigations that connect ancient mysteries to modern realities, subscribe to Tales Before Tesla. Hit that notification bell, because the stories that get buried, the connections that get ignored, the parallels that get dismissed, those are the stories that matter most. The frozen children of the Andes are still teaching us. The question is whether we are willing to learn. Thank you for staying with this journey all the way to the end. It was not easy, but the important truths never are.